Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition. You can't laugh through my introduction. Tonight's edition of Tysky Sour. Sorry, we are slightly late. We were washing our hands while singing Happy Birthday twice and sanitizing the tabletops. So it's a very hygienic episode tonight, and we have some massive stories to talk about. We are talking about Boris Johnson's government's first budget. They have found the proverbial magic money tree. We're also talking about coronavirus, and I suppose part of this budget was specifically to respond to coronavirus. We're going to talk about whether that was, whether that was up to the job and how the government are responding. And we are also going to talk about a new round, the latest round of primaries in the United States. Unfortunately, it hasn't gone as well for Bernie Sanders as we would have expected. We're going to talk about why that might have been, how the left should respond. To do so, I am joined by Ash Sarkar. How is it going?
I've got a cold, actually.
I've moved all my cups to this side of my laptop after you made that announcement.
It's fine. I've actually already sneezed on all of your personal belongings.
Well, we were talking about this before the show. A cold, because I've got a sore throat as well.
Yeah,
but
that's bad.
A sore throat is not that is not a coronavirus.
No, the sore throat is worse than the cold.
The coronavirus, it's a dry cough.
Shortness of breath.
Shortness of breath or a fever. Got none of those things.
All I'm saying is that definitely with the sneezing, I have a cold. You're looking for difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, coughing, fever.
Yeah, we're all
Although
fine.
not in that order.
I'm also joined by James
Meadway,
Meadway, ex-advisor to John McDonnell, Shadow Chancellor. Have you got any symptoms?
No, not at all. Not at all. Although I'm drinking from this horrible mug you've given me, which is concerning me slightly at this point.
So really, no symptoms, just your usual collection of neuroses.
Yeah, usual collection of neuroses. You can be completely asymptomatic and have COVID-19. You're wandering around, spreading it everywhere, and not really feel anything yourself, which is sort of the tragedy of it.
Oh, actually, before we go on to our major topics for tonight, we are going to talk about one other topic, which has been, the right in this country, they don't seem to care that much about coronavirus or the budget or investment in the north or whatever. What they care about is an out-of-context 8-second clip from an Ash Sarkar video from about 3 years ago? 4 years ago.
4 years ago.
So I suppose we'll get up the video in a moment, but I suppose to introduce it, this video has been shared thousands of times. It's been viewed by nearly 1 million people. Ben Goldsmith, who's Zach Goldsmith's brother, and a big financier. He was one of the people who sort of helped it go viral on Twitter. Ash, what's going on?
I don't know, man. People really looking for things to be angry at, I suppose. So, what it was.
Why do you hate white people, Ash? It's a question on everyone's lips now.
I've met you.
That
That's
must be
why. And unfortunately, I've had to extrapolate to your whole race on the basis of your
On behalf of white
personality.
people everywhere.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to apologise.
Let's look at the offending video, actually. Can we get up the offending video?
The white British population has decreased by 600,000, while the minority population has increased by 1.2 million. So, yes, lads, we're winning.
So Ash Sarkar, who it's disgusting, I'm even at the same table as her. She thinks that ethnic change in London is a competition and that non-white people are trying to beat white people like me to become the majority in this city, and you think you're winning and it's all disgusting, and I'm outraged,
It's
Ash.
not my fault that you can't flirt efficiently, right?
However much I flirt, the population doesn't increase.
Like a crap coronavirus of flirting, basically.
Basically this video is much longer and it's called Against Integration. You can watch it. And it's about the research by one Professor Ted Cantle, who very famously did the sort of post-mortem of the Oldham riots of the early 2000s. And a few years ago, he put out a new report saying that Britain is more segregated than ever by race. And so I had a little look through the data and I thought there were some really interesting measures. So one, he measured segregation by white British versus everyone else. Now, in this country, we don't really have monocultures the same way you do in the United States. Obviously, you've got some areas more diverse than others. You've got some areas which are, more dominated by one community than another. But in general, say you take Tottenham and you go up West Green Road, you've got Congolese restaurant, Turkish barbers, Latin village, you've got, a lot of Bengalis living there, you've got, a Romanian shop, you've got a Polish shop, and you also have white Brits. So that's diverse. To me, that doesn't look like racial segregation. That looks actually like a fairly well integrated community and something which I think would be a decent model for how we can live the rest of the country side by side. So this comment about, oh, lads, we're winning, is taking the piss out of the idea that it's a competition in which white people are under threat. And the thing that I found quite funny about the confected outrage on the basis of this 9-second clip is that, one, you're admitting that you've got no emotional intelligence and you can't detect a facetious comment when it's literally being signposted with like, oh, comedy eyebrows and like little
It wasn't
jiggle.
subtle.
It wasn't. I'm Bengali. We are not a subtle people. And number two, you can only really take offense to it if you think that racial difference on its own is a bad thing. So things like the fact that the fastest growing ethnic background in this country is mixed heritage people. I look at that and I think that's quite nice. You've got more intermarriage, you've got more mixed families, you've essentially got mixing of the kind that most sociologists would say, yeah, that's generally a good thing. But you've got this clip being driven by millions of views and loads of hate shares, which is basically people who really want to believe that white Britishness is under siege by flirtatious ethnics like myself.
The budget this morning this afternoon, in fact, was delivered by Rishi Sunak, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer. As I mentioned in the introduction, he has very much found the magic money tree that the right have been attacking the left for over the last 4 years. The left was supposed to be the irresponsible ones. How could you possibly find hundreds of billions of pounds to spend on the economy when, after they've been starving getting investment for the last 10 years? How could we have? The Conservatives, they've announced £600 billion, in fact, that they're going to be pumping into the economy. And I do not expect the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the BBC, in fact, to all be talking about how this could lead to economic catastrophe and it is not all fully funded. Obviously, when it's not the Labour Party, they're not going to give a shit. We're going to discuss it in a moment. But first of all, this is Rishi Sunak bragging about all the money the Conservatives will be spending.
Madam Deputy Speaker, over the next 5 years, we will invest more than £600 billion in our future prosperity. Public net investment will, in real terms, be the highest it's been since 1955. Take the average amount we've invested over the last 40 years in real terms, we're tripling it. Capital budgets in 24-25 alone will reach over £110 billion. I will set out the detailed capital allocations at the spending review, but I'm taking 3 major steps today. First, we're going to change the whole mindset of government to make sure economic decision-making reflects the economic geography of the country. We're reviewing the Treasury's Green Book. We'll have Treasury offices in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I can announce today that we're also opening a new economic campus in the north with over 750 staff from the Treasury, the Departments for Business, Local Government and Trade. And we won't stop there. Our ultimate ambition is to move 22,000 civil servants outside central London.
That was Rishi Sunak bragging about all the money he's going to be spending. And I mean, I think what was phenomenal about that particular part of the speech is that everything he said, you can imagine it said by a Conservative commentator in a scary voice. So he's got public spending will be the highest since 1955 if you elect Jeremy Corbyn. If you elect Jeremy Corbyn, he will triple capital spending. It's all these stuff that you can just imagine. All of these really disingenuous pundits sort of using as a reason not to vote for the Labour Party. But when it comes out of Rishi Sunak's billionaire mouth, people suddenly think, oh, actually, maybe it could be a good idea. Yeah. Anyway, what do you guys think?
So Labour was mocked mercilessly when, after the spanking in December, people suggested that they'd won the argument on things like austerity. I perhaps wouldn't go that far. I'd say certainly the argument has been won on borrowing. Rishi Sunak was behind this change to the fiscal rules. So this idea of you count borrowing towards investment in a different kind of way. You've also got this idea which has been abandoned, really. So can you explain to me, because I did English literature at university, the Laffer curve? Because they seem to have broken up with the Laffer curve.
Right, the Laffer curve is the idea popular in the early 1980s due to Laffer, whose first name I forget, which is the idea that actually if you cut taxes, you'll magically get more money in, basically because people work harder and do more productive things. So you get more and more money in the more you cut taxes. You can see an obvious problem on one side of it, which is eventually taxes are zero, at which point you get no tax money. And on the other side, it just doesn't really apply. Now, there must at some point in the future, eventually you'd hit 100% taxes and you'd probably not get that much money out of it. But the idea that you could cut taxes and get more money in, and therefore cutting taxes, rich people will actually get more and more money for the NHS, for welfare spending, for wherever it might be, was popular in the 80s, occasionally resurrected by various people on the right under fairly sort of dubious circumstances. Sometimes there's a bunch of Tories who say, oh, we cut corporation tax, but we got more corporation tax in over the last 10 years. And it's like, yeah, because we're recovering from a massive recession and corporate profits have gone up. It's not to do with you cut the tax and therefore magically you get more tax revenues in. So the Laffer curve basically is complete nonsense. It is not a credible or a fair or manageable way to try and run an economy or to do sort of any kind of economic policy.
Would you in fact say that it's laughable?
You would say that. I could have just said that and it would have been a quicker attempt at explaining the thing.
Did you ask that question just to
get to the
give you the
joke?
opportunity to get you to that?
Also, like, through the whole explanation, I was just
You
like,
took it way too seriously.
Come on.
In any case, I mean, I think the reason you're bringing that up is because you're saying that the Tories are no longer saying there's a potential crisis coming, so we better cut taxes.
They're not doing that. They've just turned
I'm
around.
saying that they've dumped the
said,
Laffer curve.
They'd say that on corporation taxes, they've refused to cut taxes for large corporations any further. They're still very low in this country, thanks to George Osborne and 10 years of Tories. But they're saying, we'll get another £6.4 billion from not cutting taxes. So they're rejecting the Laffer curve. And they're saying that actually if we tax corporations, we'll get more money in.
We are going to. I want to break up our discussion about the budget into two parts. So the first, which is sort of what seems to be the Conservative vision for the next 5 years, and then the other part being, the response to coronavirus and is it sufficient? So before we talk about what their vision might be for the next 5 years, I want to get up some of their key announcements from this budget. So they included, as you saw in that video, more than 600 billion is set to be spent on roads, rail, broadband and housing by the middle of 2025. Alcohol and fuel tax will be frozen. The tax threshold for national insurance contributions will rise from £8,632 to £9,500. New £1 billion fund to remove all unself-combustible cladding from all public and private housing higher than 18 metres. That one should have been announced the day after that tragic fire. I mean, the fact that they're not announcing that till 3 years later is just phenomenal to me. And this will all amount to a total additional borrowing of £96.6 billion by 2023 to 2024 to pay for all of these spending commitments. So, I mean, in terms of, I've put in the national insurance contributions there, but basically there's not much changes to tax. And the big headline to me just seems to be this £600 billion that they're going to spend on infrastructure.
I mean,
is that a key takeaway?
You were shaking your head there.
Yeah, I'm shaking my head at two things. One, the changes to tax that are in there, the government's own distribution analysis, buried away as it usually is, in one of the annexes to the main budget document. I think it's chart 2.A. You can go and dig it out. It shows that the tax changes that they're introducing will hugely benefit wealthier people, and that if you're in the poorest 10%, you'll be worse off as a result of some of the tax tweaks that they've introduced here. So in terms of the distribution, in terms of inequality, then what they're doing with tax and benefit changes will make richer people better off, broadly speaking. That's what they're doing. The £600 billion, I'm sorry, I'm finding it quite hard to get to the bottom of this one. It is not all new money. The current projected government spend on capital investment over the next 5 years is about £265 billion. So at the limit, they're saying 235 billion additional spending is what they want to do. 600 billion is just a number. It's worth bearing in mind when Labour said they were going to spend 400 billion pounds during the election. It's like, oh, ludicrous. And then suddenly they turn around, 2-3 months later and say 600 billion to make it sound good. There is some additional capital spending in there. In other words, capital spending being like build a hospital, invest money in roads, invest money in railways. Let's come back to the roads, actually. 27 billion pounds for roads. But at the same time, they're saying that we are going to try and be green, we're going to be environmental and all the rest of it. Absolute nonsense. 27 billion pounds a road. At the most, £8 billion capital investment, so investment in sort of infrastructure and physical kit for climate change measures. So it's nonsense, right? There's a sort of a great deal of spin on top of a genuine change in what the government's doing. There has been a genuine change. The genuine change is that all of a sudden, after 10 years of being told we must balance the books, this is the most important thing that could possibly exist, they turn around and gone, sod it, we can just spend. Here we are, we're just doing this. The coronavirus part of that is about £30 billion of additional spending, but they're saying this is a one-off payment. It's not something we're going to have to do in the future. We can come back to this point because this is going to be something you have to do in the future. But for now, they're saying, we'll run a deficit. It's to deal with the spending. That's that.
I mean, the left are having, I suppose, on Twitter at least, and I think probably on the opposition benches as well, are a bit confused about how to respond to this. Do you say Labour have won the argument and yes, it's great that you're spending all this money, but that's thanks to us? Or do you say that actually this isn't austerity being ended, it's, you're lying fundamentally, or just say, it's a shit budget?
I mean, this is the 5th time I can remember austerity being ended by the Conservative Party, really since George Osborne in 2015, who announced that austerity was over, and that wasn't the case. You look at the things which aren't included in this budget at all. Universal credit doesn't get a mention. Social care, despite Boris Johnson arriving on the steps of Downing Street saying that he's got a plan, it's ready to go, we've heard not a peep on social care. And even though it was being briefed that the Tories might do something completely batshit for them and introduce a wealth tax, there was no mention of that either. So there are 3 really fundamental absences from this budget. I do think that where it presents the left with a problem, and I sort of, again, being a bit facetious, was like, congratulations to Rishi Sunak on delivering Labour's first budget for a decade, is that it's worth thinking about the way in which what Labour economics is thought of in lots of different ways. Now, for me, fundamentally, Labour's approach to economics shouldn't just be, okay, we borrow big and we invest in some big infrastructure projects, but ultimately the way in which the economy is composed, who benefits and who doesn't, the way in which essentially you're relying on asset inflation to mask the fact that you've got a low productivity economy. That's not, leaving those things intact doesn't make it a Labour budget. Really what we're trying to talk about are the ways in which you can have a more productive economy, one which also prioritises things like human happiness and care and thinks about how we can sustainably live on this planet rather than extract it for all it's worth for 10 years and then, we're all going to die. Please build the Elysium spaceship. So for me, that's the difference there. But perhaps the place that we're at now, where there's this sort of inevitable, OKR tanks being parked on Labour's lawn, et cetera, it also speaks to a failure of the left to articulate clearly what its ideas are around the economy. Not looking at you, not for 1 second. But there was certainly, do you remember that Momentum video from last year, which was any government spending is socialism? Things like that, where it's like anything done by the government with money is socialism. Well, no, it's not.
This is, I think that's absolutely critical to this. I mean, I do really dislike the expression tanks on Labour's lawn, tanks on the lawn. It's nonsense.
That's not where tanks go.
It's if you've won when your opponent is making your arguments for you, right? When Rishi Sunak, this he was Goldman Sachs, wasn't he? Former Goldman Sachs banker, pops up, a Tory MP, a Tory chancellor pops up and says, we are spending all of this money and we're going to borrow to do it, and that's great, and we're going to invest in science and technology, and it's going to be outside of London. And it's like, these are literally arguments that John McDonnell in particular has made since late 2015 when he became Shadow Chancellor. When your enemies, when your political opponents are making your argument, that is when you know you have won. Margaret Thatcher said it herself. How did she know he won? Because of Tony Blair, right? That is what's happening here. So that argument's won. The challenge now is to get to okay, we got that. What are we going to do for the real political argument, the real economic argument that we want to get to over this? And they've opened this one up. If they created a space where suddenly it's actually okay for the government to spend and stuff, fine, take it, thank you very much. The real argument to have is exactly as Ash said, which is over the distribution of power in the economy and over how we actually make this economy work for the future. Because what was striking about all of this is that of the big challenges that we know are bearing down on us, Never mind the fact they haven't dealt with most of austerity. I mean, if you take the sort of headline figures, by 2024-25, public spending will be back to the kind of levels, or near to the kind of levels it was in 2010. So, 14, 15 years later, this is like a total lack of progress, if you like. Incidentally, we have an older population, so, it won't feel like it's much better. But if you want to get to a real argument about it, what is the distribution of power in the economy? That isn't just about let's hand out some goodies to people and hope they tug their forelocks and say thank you very much, benevolent Tory government, we finally got a new railway station in whichever part of the country it is. That's one part of it. The other bit is the challenges bearing down are, how do we adapt to climate change? Never mind. Never mind. We have to do something about mitigating climate change, but how do you adapt to climate change? How do you adapt to a world in which pandemics become more frequent? This is the world we now live in. You can dig out the World Bank reports on this. The fact that we are imposing so much pressure on the ecology of the planet, urbanization, intensive farming, increased international travel, extended supply chains, means that pandemics become more frequent. So if you think coronavirus this time round is a one-off and we can all carry on, everything carries on the same afterwards, that will not happen. Or at the very least, there's a significant risk it won't happen. What do we do to mitigate that? How do we change how the economy operates so we're not just crashing into the environment the whole time? That's the world we now live in. Was there anything serious in this? No, of course not. £27 billion for roads. That was the major capital commitment that was announced. It wasn't serious about all the other stuff.
I mean, one of the things that I guess I want to ask, and this sort of seeps into the Bernie Sanders stuff, is how the left has in some ways flopped it on political strategy, not necessarily the ideas, not necessarily the policies, not necessarily the vision in terms of where we have to go and the challenges we have to adapt to, but actually how do you shape the electorate? How do you bring the electorate with you? And how do you have these ideas replicate themselves amongst the electorate? And when in government, do you change class composition in such a way that it keeps producing an electorate that will keep you in government, which is what Thatcher did so well. And I think that these are some of really pressing questions. I think that when it comes to adapting to some of the demands of the electorate and making sure that you sort of protect exposed flanks when it comes to policy and messaging, Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings have done spectacularly well. The reason why 27 billion in road maintenance really appeals to people, I don't fucking get it. I don't know how to drive. I have an Oyster card. But talk to mates of mine who live outside London, and it's not just, well, I rely on my car a lot. The idea of being a motorist, a driver, it's really integral to your identity and how you see yourself and the way in which you relate to the world. Tapping into that is an obvious short-term thing to do. £27 billion for roads. Oh, that's great.
£2.5 billion on potholes, I think. So that was,
yes,
that was
50 million potholes to be filled in.
Strongly about potholes.
Actually, they are. Look, I'm not surprised why they do. It's incredibly annoying to have that. Why are the potholes appearing? Because we've cut capital spending over the last 10 years. So well done. Similar thing with homelessness. How much did they announce? 640 million is the figure in my head for dealing with homelessness. Large amount of money. Why is there homelessness? Because we've done austerity for the last 10 years. A lot of this stuff is sort of compensating for the car crash, the train wreck, the waste. And it was 10 wasted years of austerity. That's the main thing out of this, is that we never, ever needed to do any of this stuff. We could have made this spending 10 years ago. We would all be better off and live in a less environmentally destructive world and have less stupidly insecure jobs and generally be happier people if we'd not done what was imposed on us 10 years ago, which was austerity for this period of time. If we'd had this budget in 2010, it would have made more sense to get there. But we didn't. We had to wait 10 years to get there instead.
All right, we need to move on to the coronavirus part of the budget. But first of all, you're watching Tisky Sour. You're watching Novara Media. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. So if you want to fund us to wash up James Meadway's cups properly, so that we can actually have some antiviral spray on the tables instead of just me spitting and rubbing it with a tissue, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month to keep us all alive. Also, I'm going to tell you all the other things.
It used to be new media for a different politics. Now it's adequate media to keep Michael Walker alive.
A tenner to keep us, reasonably healthy. Also like this video, it helps us with the algorithm. There's over 1,000 of you watching it. There's only 232 of you who have tapped it. You don't have to tap it with a real finger. so you won't catch anything. It's just it's just on your
actually
laptop.
have to lick the screen.
Doesn't cost anything.
Oh.
It's incredibly safe, incredibly cheap actually to like the video. Keep your comments coming. You can tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. Oh, and also there is a link to this video in the Twitter description. No, in the YouTube description. If you retweet that, it means more people will arrive at the show. The next thing we are going to talk about is the coronavirus elements of this budget. It was pitched as the government's response to coronavirus, both to, I suppose, bring about the conditions whereby people can stay in their homes and take time off work so that they don't pass on coronavirus to other people, but also to keep the economy rolling. We're going to talk about the extent to which coronavirus looks like it will cause a massive economic crash in this country and all over the world. First of all, here are the announcements that were in that budget relating to coronavirus. So you have £5 billion emergency response fund to support the NHS and other public services in England. All those advised to self-isolate will be entitled to statutory sick pay, often not enough, even if they have not presented with symptoms. So before they were saying you have to be ill before you get sick pay. Now, if you've been told to self-isolate, you can get sick pay as well. Self-employed workers who are not eligible will be able to claim contributory employment support allowance, and employment support allowance benefit will be available from day one, not after a week as now. Always seemed a bit odd to me why you have to wait a week anyway, whether or not there's coronavirus around. People have to feed themselves in that first week. £500 million hardship fund for councils in England to help the most vulnerable in their areas. Firms with fewer than 250 staff will be refunded for sick pay payments for 2 weeks. That seems quite a good one because it means that your small business owner shouldn't be pressuring you to not call in sick. Well, I suppose you're still not doing the work, whatever. Small firms will be able to access business interruption loans of up to £1.2 million. So that'll be, if businesses have to shut down for a couple of weeks, they might not be able to pay their bills. And business rates in England will be abolished in retail, leisure and hospitality sectors with a rateable value below 51 grand. So that's, a little bit of support to small businesses so they can survive whatever shutdown they have to do during, the coronavirus spike.
Have I been saying coronavirus wrong all this time? Because you're saying it with a short O.
Coronavirus. Oh, I just say that to make it sound less like the beer. Is it Corona?
I'm sure it's Corona. It's like Corona.
Right, Gary
isn't it?
says that I'm saying it right.
So it is coronavirus.
Excellent. I mean, so look, some of these measures, obviously good, important. There's been a lot of conversation around sick pay and when it will start to kick in for people. These are good things. It doesn't change the fact that the amount of sick pay that we get in this country, protected by law, is shit when you compare it to the rest of Europe. And when you have such terrible sick pay provision, you are actively disincentivizing people from staying at home when they're sick, because plenty of people are looking at a straight choice between paying bills, food on the table for my kids, or staying home and looking after the collective health of the population. For most people, needing to feed their families will win out. And I think that when it comes to how we imagine public health measures in this country, I think 40 years of neoliberalism has done a lot to corrode the idea of a collective subject. So the idea that sick pay isn't an entitlement, it's a public health measure. Or indeed, things like elderly social care, not an entitlement, it's a public health measure. We've got 6 million carers in this country who are caring for one of their relatives. A third of those carers are themselves over 65. Now, my grandma lives with my stepdad and my mum because she needs more care now that she's older, cooking meals, company, help with various tasks. Let's say my mum on the tube back gets coronavirus, gets the fever, blah, blah, blah. And so she takes the advice to self-isolate. She self-isolates in a house which has got someone who's over 80 years old in it. Let's say she's able to effectively self-isolate within that house. And so the whole order of who uses the bathroom and blah, 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 all of that goes fine. When you have an elderly relative in the house who needs care and needs to be cooked for and needs to be helped around to move, it's not as simple as that. And we created these conditions by not having a proper social care system in this country. And so it seems to me that, yes, the Conservative Party have to some extent turned on the taps when it comes to borrowing, But it's all entirely reactive and short-termist. The idea that you need to build these institutions which are universal and that will make for a more resilient and healthy population is absolutely nowhere to be seen.
James, do you think? I suppose we should also note actually that this morning the Bank of England reduced the interest rate from 0.75 to 0.25, so that was 0.25%, and that was coordinated with the government to try and give a big signal that the government is going to be there to keep the economy going.
It barely matters. There's sort of signalling effect in the base rate reduction. They've also offered, they've extended the term, the term funding scheme and some support for businesses over the next few years, basically making it cheaper to borrow to get through periods where they can't necessarily meet the demands made in them in terms of cash because nobody's buying anything because they're all locked in the houses or supposed to be locked in the houses. This isn't going to be adequate. Is the first thing to say in it. The provision that's been made for statutory sick pay, I think, is farcical because Britain has around about the second lowest level of statutory sick pay relative to average wages out of any European country. So that's already bad. The fact it's been extended to the first day, it should never, ever not have been the first day. And by the way, one of the things we have to say when this has presumably died down somewhat in 3-4 months' time is that these things ought to remain in place permanently. The provision for if you're self-employed, which is not statutory sick pay, it's getting forced onto some of the other forms of benefit that are out there, are not adequate. The provision overall is not enough to deal with the scale of the crisis that we're running into. And it's important to get the fundamentals of this one. The COVID-19 disease is caused by a virus which is really exceptionally transmissible between people. It is very, very infectious, significantly above, it would seem, the SARS epidemic of 2002-2003, significantly above, as far as you can tell, things like Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, certainly above what normally we get as the sort of seasonal flu and this sort of thing. And that's bad when you also then have not so much that it kills lots of people, it doesn't. It kills people who are susceptible to it. They have some pre-existing condition, they're elderly, this sort of thing. The fatality rate in Hubei in China is 14% if you're over the age of 80. It is quite seriously bad if you're elderly. It's quite seriously bad if you have some pre-existing condition. And it's pretty bad for everyone else because there's a large number of people who end up with some acute condition where you need treatment. That's the point at which, as you see happening in Italy, your health service gets overwhelmed with a load of people who need to have really quite intensive care. Now, Britain does not have a particularly adequate supply of intensive and acute care, I should say, beds.
Well, you look what happens every winter.
Exactly. And already, if you look in London, acute bed usage is around about 90% throughout the NHS. Now, you take Germany, it's about 23 acute care beds per 100,000 people. In this country, it's about 6. European average is something around 8, right? So Germany's very well provided. We are very underprovided. So that overwhelms the existing health system once you get large numbers of people with the disease. That means one of the things you have to do, and one of the things that should already have happened, is the government should, in fact, have told people, this is what's going on. You need to self-isolate immediately. Here is the financial assistance to make sure that you can do this, because it's no good saying to people, work from home or something, if you can't work from home because you're supposed to be in a shop or a factory or wherever it might be. It's fine if you have a relatively white-collar job and go and sit at home and tootle around the internet. It doesn't seem too bad. We've seen this in China, by the way. The class division in this is striking. The way it reinforces inequality is striking. If you're reasonably well off, you can sit at home, order Deliveroo's or whatever it might be, and okay, 2 weeks.
So in China, when they told people to stay at home, for example, or physically stop them from getting to their jobs, did they provide benefits for those people when they were at home house? I haven't read much about this.
The Chinese benefit system is frankly underdeveloped at best, and there's a very, very large informal sector. So you end up with a large number of people who are really in quite a dire situation as a result of basically being told you have to stay there and you can't go to work, right? And that has been very, very strictly enforced, which in a sort of epidemiological, in a healthcare sense, is like one way to solve this. The reason it's so strict is because the virus is so infectious. And so you have to be pretty extreme in how you monitor and control for it. Now, you can be less dramatic than that. Part of what's happened in China, you also see it happening in South Korea, is that you try and monitor where people are going. So the second stage of this thing is not just control. You stop people moving around. You try and trace where they've been, and then you sort of monitor that. Now, that can be a very sort of intrusive process of working out where people have got to. Did anyone see the announcement this morning that of course, Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson invited in the tech companies to go and like have a nice gathering and work out what everyone's doing with this. And this is, by the way, one of the things that comes out of this, the other side, is that suddenly we have a far more intensive surveillance through our mobile phones, through everything else we do, than we're used to as a result of this. But that is part of potentially how you try and deal with some of the problem of people wandering around. You need to trace who they talk to because it's infectious. So you have to trace where the virus has got to because you can't control it as effectively as you would like on quarantine alone.
There's some hot disagreements in the comments going on at the moment. So Stefano, who I'm a fan of now, says pronounce coronavirus however you want, Michael. But
Have you been shamed into elongating your O?
Yuppie Prol Pace disagrees. He says, Michael, if you keep calling it coronavirus or coronavirus, I'm going to start telling everyone they need to start watching Thai Sky Sour. Fair enough.
Don't do that.
I'm going to start calling it coronavirus.
Don't punish
Thai
me.
Sky
just
Sour,
because-
I think.
We're
I'll
going to
go
talk
for.
about the government's response to coronavirus in general in a moment. First of all, I just wanted to point out, we've been talking now about how measures in the budget might be inadequate. There also was one measure slipped in there that's gone largely unnoticed, which is not just inadequate, but actively harmful to this country's ability to deal with coronavirus. It is related to the surcharge that migrants have to pay to use the NHS, even though they already pay taxes. So it shouldn't exist in the first place, but it has been increased. So for adults, the surcharge was £400 a year to use the NHS. It's gone up to £624 per year. For children, it was £300 and it's gone up to £470 per year. This is bigger than a 50% increase. It's massive. And EU migrants who didn't have to pay it before will now have to pay it. So
it will
that's
have
a
to
lot
be
more
for
people having to
new-
pay for their own healthcare.
It will have to be for new EU migrants. As far as I can tell, it's not
Yeah.
going to apply to people who already live in this country. Now, it's not the case that you've got to pay £620 when you go to the hospital because you got drunk on a trampoline and you broke your leg. It's something that you have to pay as part of the visa application process. But where that does totally fuck our healthcare system and therefore our resilience when it comes to things like coronavirus or indeed anything else that's going on with public health is that it disincentivizes migrants from coming to this country and working in the NHS. We have a huge staffing shortage of nurses and doctors in particular. You've got a huge staffing shortage in the social care sector as well. Now, faced with that staffing shortage, and it's not the case that we have this, horrendously uneducated population and all you have to do is train up more British doctors and nurses. I mean, one way in which you could do that is by making tuition free. It's because we have an aging population. You have an infrastructure which needs to be staffed properly. And who is going to want to come to work in this healthcare system if you have to fork out £620 for the privilege? It's insane.
We're going to look at the government response and I suppose concerns about the government response to coronavirus quite quickly because then I want to move on to Bernie Sanders. I'm going to bring up an article now. So this was in Bloomberg today, this morning. The headline was, Keep Calm and Wash Your Hands, Britain's Strategy to Beat the Virus.
God, I hate this tweet shit so
read
much.
out the first two paragraphs. It says, while China quarantined 56 million people and the whole of Italy is on lockdown to counter the spread of coronavirus, the UK is taking a radically different approach. Instead of keeping people inside their homes, Boris Johnson's government is trying to get inside their heads, shunning headline measures like travel restrictions and quarantines to focus on a more banal task, finding ways to persuade people to wash their hands. This advice that the government is taking about how to deal with coronavirus is from the Nudge Unit. It's something that was created in 2010 by David Cameron. The idea, it was all part of his big society where you make the state a bit smaller and instead of having active government policies, you just have a small unit that tells people to do stuff on social media. So they're the unit who encouraged people to get, I get them quite a lot, those texts that say you still haven't done your tax return, Maybe you could try do it tomorrow.
So instead of staffing HMRC to, enable
Answer
them
the
to
phone.
investigate and audit and collect taxes from huge corporations, you've just got Michael Walker's phone pinging.
To be fair, all of those
Every 15
texts do
minutes.
actually make me do my tax return on time. But
Yeah,
I suppose
but-
the issue is,
but-
Maybe
the
you
issue is
should
it's
wash
good,
your hands.
It's
But-
good enough for
Bing.
getting you to do your tax return, but is this
But does it
this
make
an
Philip
approach good
Green pay
enough
more
for...
of his tax? Does it make Richard Branson pay more of his tax? Does it make, Jeff Bezos pay more of his tax?
This-
Only Michael Walker and, sorry babe, but you're Brokey McBrokerson.
Well, it's also a big risk when it comes to a public health or a potential public health disaster, right? To hope that you can just nudge people into washing their hands enough.
It seems to fatally underestimate the sort of basic biological problem of this particular virus, this new novel coronavirus, which is that it is exceptionally infectious. That is what makes it worrying. And it's that awkward balance with a virus where it's very infectious, so it doesn't necessarily kill too many people. And it's kind of, you can wander around with it for quite some period of time without any symptoms. So it spreads very rapidly. And the problem isn't that most people get it and therefore they die. It's not Ebola. 60% of people who get Ebola die, right? It is absolutely lethal and horrible and immediate, but that's why it doesn't spread very far. This one, you get it and you wander around a bit and you meet your friend and they go and visit their grand gets it and they maybe die. That's the problem with this one. So the idea that you sort of nudge people a little bit to wash their hands slightly more, the idea that you just sort of make these minimal interventions, and by the way, make those interventions rather too late in the day, and this gets us through this, I think is absolute nonsense. We're probably, 2, 3, 4 weeks away from having to do things like Italy is doing at this point in time. And that's kind of the rough sort of path we appear to be heading down. And that does mean suddenly you have to tell people to stay in their homes. You don't go out too much.
I mean, one of the things which I think is incredibly alarming about the coronavirus outbreak in the UK is that I do sometimes feel that our media culture is uniquely stupid and irresponsible when it comes to covering it. So I cannot tell you the amount of times I've been, texted by a producer who's asking me to come on the news specifically to talk about coronavirus. And I'm like, look, much to the disappointment of everyone, not least my mother, I am not a medical doctor. This is not my job. It's one thing for if it comes up in conversation on some kind of panel show for me to go, oh, okay, these are some of my observations, but hey, don't take my word for it. I'm not a fucking doctor. And another to have your opinion deliberately sought out to talk to the public on something which you are not qualified to talk about. It's so irresponsible. And then you add to that, when it does come up in some of those panel-y conversations, I have heard the most batshit things you would not believe. I was doing like a late night paper review on the Stephen Nolan show on BBC 5 Live with Lance Foreman, who is a former Brexit Party MEP. And quite sincerely, he was like, well, I'm not an expert in these things, but I've heard that Wuhan is a center for biological weapons testing in China. So I wonder if that's got something to do with that.
On Radio 5? Wow.
He said it completely unchallenged. You know, seeking out Nigel Farage's opinion. What's Newsnight thinking? This is not the time for any rando with a big gob to just hold forth. Even on some of these, sort of morning, breakfasty show things, I've definitely heard people saying oh, well, you should stock up on loo roll because the Chinese are putting all their resources into making face masks now. I have no idea where they got that from. All I know is that in Sainsbury's and Superdrug and Tesco's and Lidl, you've got people alligator wrestling for the last roll of Andrex. And that doesn't seem to me to be a particularly responsible media culture.
But this is a failure of government communication from the off. Like, why are people panic buying loo roll? I mean, there is a horrible logic to panic buying, which is that you have to panic buy because everyone else is panic buying. Otherwise, the thing you want to panic buy runs out. And of course, you doing that means everybody else has to do it. So this is all self-confirming logic. It's like a bank run. You have to go to the bank to get your money out because everybody else is doing it. You have to buy loo roll because everybody else is buying loo roll. But there's no real reason to do this. And your list of symptoms of what COVID-19 will give you. I mean, mostly it's like a fever and a dry. We were just talking about this, and a dry cough. Somewhere down the line, it's like organ failure and like diarrhea and stuff. But basically, your loo roll isn't going to help you much at this point. So why on earth everyone thinks they have to run off and do this is not quite clear. This looks to me like, by the way, a failure of government communications. It should have been made very clear much earlier on that these are things it will do, these are things it won't do, and this is what you might need to do to deal with it.
But I also think that people are, in a kind of macabre way, quite fascinated by the idea of being at the center of an epidemic. Because yes, there have been pandemics before within living memory, but for lots of people, the memory of HIV and the AIDS crisis is like, oh, people who have some kind of deviant behavior, it's nothing really to do with me. And I think that there's this fascination and this sort of idea of like almost an excitement, which is ripped people over it. Do you know what I mean?
Well, in a way, it's a sort of massive cultural event. So, I mean, it's kind of sad in a way because on the one hand, there's a large proportion of the population who are thinking like, wow, this is kind of, like on Question Time last Thursday, it was really interesting.
Do you still watch it?
I always watch the
Only
first
when I'm on it.
I always watch the first 20 minutes and then after that I can't handle it anymore. But it was there was all five of them up there with Matt Hancock, and instead of them having a Barney as usual, it was sort of they redid it. So it was the audience asking Matt Hancock questions, him sort of saying like, I'm the government of national unity standing here, and people were literally talking about the Blitz spirit, and it was like, oh, aren't we all coming together to deal with this?
Do you remember when
conflict?
we were excited about the World Cup?
Dimly, yeah.
And not like,
everyone got
oh, I wonder
together.
if my grandmother's going to perish in a pandemic.
Yeah, no, but the thing is, you can all come together for World Cup, and that's nice. You all come together for this. Most of you like get a horrible disease, and some of your elderly relatives will die. So,
I mean, that's the thing. So
very different.
Some people are like,
dynamic,
this is interesting because it's interesting to see what's already gone off the shelves in Lidl. But there's also people with immunosuppressant.
Yeah.
I mean, also, can
diseases,
I
which is
just say
chronic
that when it
illnesses.
comes to stockpiling, no one will ever have a patch on Bengali aunties because they've been stockpiling them 10 kilo bags of Tilda rice since the mid-90s. You've got the sofa covered in plastic because it makes the fabric last longer, but also you can wipe it down with Dettol.
Oh, that's good.
In case of
That's good,
pandemic.
yeah.
And, I remember I looked in like my mum's freezer, stuffed to the gills with ice cream tubs, not a lick of ice cream in there. It's like dal, korma, biryani. And it's kind of like a time capsule because she's feeding 4 people. She cooks for 400. And then these frozen bricks of deliciously spiced food items go in there, not to be eaten at some later date. It's for future generations.
Or the 2 weeks you have to spend, locked in your own
We
flat.
should move on. We should move on to Bernie Sanders.
No, we're doing stockpiling
We should move on to
tips.
Bernie Sanders in a moment. First of all, if you're worried that you've been,
Bangladeshi.
if you're worried that for the last 15 minutes you've been watching 3 people who aren't medical experts talk about coronavirus, let's get up a tweet from someone who is a medical expert. This is the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, so that's the country's most prestigious medical journal. He says, so the UK government, that is Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson, claim they are following the science, but that is not true. The evidence is clear. We need urgent implementation of social distancing and closure policies. The government is playing roulette with the public. This is a major error. So someone who does know what he's talking about, who's not impressed with
People
the
should read
nudge
the
unit
Lancet, by
taking
the way.
control.
The Lancet has like really, really good coverage and material on the latest in medical advances. One of the interesting, you can say this is stand back and interesting. One of the things that comes out of this is, and this is partly why it's different to SARS, is the speed with which medical information can transfer. So the speed with which the sequence, the genome sequencing of the virus has been produced and publicly distributed and this sort of thing is why, if you want the optimistic side, is why we're probably much closer to getting an effective workable vaccine than we would have been with the SARS epidemic. The SARS vaccine took about 20 months from initially diagnosing it through to getting the thing. And probably this time around it will be a bit shorter. So, there is some cause for hope out there if your viewers were thinking otherwise.
I'm going to start reading The Lancet because I've been learning everything I know about infectious diseases by playing Plague Inc. on my phone.
Also very good.
All my diseases are called things like drip, fleek, swag. And when I see things like drip has infected the world, I'm like, yeah, it has.
Oh God, the drip sounds like a really horrible STI, doesn't it? Okay, we are going to move on to Bernie Sanders. So last night, 6 more states voted in the Democratic primaries. This came after Super Tuesday last week. Joe Biden had quite a good night. A bit underwhelming for Bernie Sanders. He needed a big win last night. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. That didn't come. So Joe Biden won the most delegates and the popular vote in Idaho, Missouri, Mississippi, and most importantly, Michigan. Michigan obviously important because 1, Bernie Sanders, that was one of his big surprise wins in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. And 2, well, it was the biggest state of the night, but also this is one of the 3 key states that the Democrats need to win back off Trump in 2020. So part of Bernie Sanders' argument was that, his vision of democratic socialism could win back some of those white working class voters who shifted to Donald Trump. Obviously, as we always say on the show, it's white working class who aren't necessarily the main support for Donald Trump. Lots of rich people love Donald Trump, but they were some of the swing voters in 2016. Bernie Sanders won North Dakota, which was the smallest state voting on the night, and Washington State, it's got Seattle, and that's the major city there, is still neck and neck. So the route for Bernie Sanders to win the nomination is still open, still possible when you look at the delegate maps, but it is getting harder and harder. But Bernie Sanders, he's definitely staying in the race. There is a debate on Sunday between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. It's unfortunate that didn't happen immediately after Super Tuesday, because I think everyone was, the moment we all knew that it was only Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden at this point, we were like, he's going to fucking kill him when he gets onto a debate stage. But luckily unluckily, that was not able to
Freudian
happen
slip.
before.
That was a slip, wasn't it?
Michael's
Cool.
just like,
Deep
I like
eight.
the spectacle.
Class war, social democracy without the class war. Or the
Without the
social
social
democracy.
democracy. Yeah, you're not going to get social democracy with Joe Biden. We are going to now look at Bernie Sanders' response to the results. This was just a couple of hours ago.
Joe, what are you going to do for the 500,000 people who go bankrupt in our country because of medically related debt? And what are you going to do for the working people of this country and small business people who are paying on average 20% of their incomes for health care? Joe, what are you going to do to end the absurdity of the United States of America being the only major country on earth where health care is not a human right? Are you really going to veto a Medicare for all bill if it is passed in Congress? Joe, how are you going to respond to the scientists who tell us we have 7 or 8 years remaining to transform our energy system before irreparable harm takes place to this planet because of the ravages of climate change?
That was Bernie Sanders. Still, fighting talk. He's talking about all the distinctions between himself and Joe Biden, including pointing out that Joe Biden earlier in the week said that he would potentially veto Medicare for all as president, even if it had passed in Congress, in the Senate and the House of Representatives. Bananas thing to say if you're running for the Democratic nomination. Doesn't seem to have damaged his campaign. But the tone is changing somewhat in the sense that he's saying, Joe, are you going to do this? Instead of, you shouldn't vote for Joe because X, Y, Z. And it made me think that maybe he is now shifting his strategy to what can I get Joe Biden to commit to until the point at which I concede the race. I don't know. What do you think?
Which is smart, quite frankly, because like you said, the window in which Sanders can conceivably secure the Democrat nomination is rapidly narrowing. So I think working towards thinking about what is the kind of persuasive power and policy-making power that the left can hold moving forward is the right thing to do. When it comes to the post-mortem of what went wrong for Sanders, what went right for Biden, is that there's quite similar dynamics as to what's gone on in the UK, which is Sanders does very, very well dominating low turnout voter groups. And without a successful strategy to either drastically increase turnout amongst those voter groups or to make inroads into high turnout voter groups, is that there's no way that you're not going to be squeezed out, either in the primary, as we're seeing now, or indeed in the general, as we've seen in this country. I think there were also perhaps specific blind spots with the Sanders campaign. It's true that he, in the last 4 years, has really refined and honed his pitch to voters of color, in particular precariously employed, Latino Americans. However, there was still an issue of trust and comfort and ease when it comes to older African American voters. And I was trying to think through reasons why that is, when objectively he has the much stronger record on issues of race, certainly compared to Biden, who was opposed to busing, an architect of mass incarceration. And it's this business of electability. Now, electability doesn't mean who is the person that I want to vote for. Electability is this strange sort of, periscope of trying to look at something through mirrors and filters, and it's at a distance from where you're standing. And so it means that how you perceive who other people are going to be vote for is, of course, shaped a great deal by news media. And you have an even more skewed broadcast landscape in the United States than you do here. Quite frankly, it's deranged. It's just hair, teeth, and racism. And no wonder it's been a really effective machine at trying to constrain the possibilities presented by Bernie Sanders. Now, that doesn't let the Sanders campaign off the hook no more than the biased broadcasting environment in the UK lets the Corbyn campaign or the left here off the hook. These are things that you have to adjust to, strategize around, or indeed confront directly. But these are the challenges facing any left electoral project. I think the way that you worded it when I was stalking your timeline earlier this week is that you said, well, maybe the ceiling is just lower for left populism than it is for its right-wing counterpart. Well, perhaps it's not an immutable ceiling, which is some sort of fact of human nature. Maybe it's the fact that right-wing populism and this idea of what constitutes the people and who it is you need to make suffer for any sort of advance that you make on behalf of one community over here, is that that's been embedded for decades. It's easy, it's familiar, it's mother's milk, you know?
I want to do a longer show on sort of if there is, because it's very much an open question about is there a lower ceiling for left-wing populism than right-wing populism? Because well, it seems like it, right? Because people say, oh, there was these faults in the Bernie Sanders campaign, but there were way more fucking faults in the Donald Trump campaign in 2016.
Well, I mean, look, you have to get more things right if you're doing this.
Yeah, it's harder. Right? You're playing it on hard mode. I mean, one thing I was thinking is potentially, so one of the reasons why people are saying maybe Bernie Sanders didn't perform as well as we'd hoped, especially among, older voters, is that it's seen as a risk voting for a populist. I think people also saw it as a risk voting for Donald Trump.
It's seeing the wrong way around. This is a real perception problem that people get, because you look at you always get these sort of age breakdowns of who voted for what, and it's very, very stark on some of the exit polling.
I'm actually going to stop you. Let's get up that graphic. Just hold your thought.
Oh yeah, you can see it.
So we've got this graphic up. It's showing you, if you're listening on the podcast, in the 18 to 24 section, Joe Biden is getting 16% of the vote. Bernie Sanders 83% of the vote. But that only accounts for 7% of voters. And it's not just super young voters. So all the way up to 40 to 49, Bernie Sanders is beating Joe Biden. But it's once you get over 50 that Biden, just runs away with the vote. So he's got 66 to 27 over, people who are 50 to 64. And people who are 65 or over, he gets 73% to 23% for Bernie Sanders. And if you look at the percentage of what proportion of voters these make up, 23% of people who voted in those Michigan primaries, almost 1 in 4, they were over 65, 32% were over, between 55 and 64. So let me do the instant maths. Is that almost 50, no, more than 50, 55% of people who were voting were over 50. Sorry, finish your point now.
No. I mean, that's sort of part of it, but it's also like, if you look at the graph, the issue you get is a sort of misperception of it, where you go like, oh God, all these young people are voting overwhelmingly for Bernie Sanders. And, oh God, all these old people are voting overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, or equivalently Labour versus Tory. It comes out almost exactly the same. And you think, oh no, we must get more and more of these people, like low turnout people, to turn out here, and then God knows what we do about this lot. I mean, voter suppression is not really part of the left's repertoire, and probably rightly so. But the real hinge of this,
probably there.
The real hinge of this is what
plausible
happens in the
deniability.
middle.
I'm not saying we should wipe coronavirus.
I'm really not.
I've been watching that documentary about the Ragnishis. They to try and win a vote.
Yeah,
it's an
Wild
amazing
Country.
documentary
Yes.
on Netflix. To try and win a vote in their
that.
small county, they rubbed what was it? Salmonella all over the salad bars. Sorry, anyway, finish your point.
You've just seen Meadway going around harvesters in this country. He's like, I'm in my 2-week asymptomatic
we
period.
can't get into no.
This would be completely immoral, by the way.
So getting the it's
We
complete,
condemn his behaviour 100%.
It's complete nonsense. But which is why the hinge of this is actually the people in the middle, which is how do you get those marginal voters who do turn out in that kind of 40 to 50 range? Unfortunately, and someone did point this out to me, it's basically, to break it to your various viewers, it is centrist dads and presumably centrist mums who are the people you have to sort of target here. Like if you take the 2017 election, I was slightly loath to do the direct parallel between the US and the UK because they're two very different places, but there are some patterns. In 2017, there was the biggest sort of switchers in terms of party, memory serves, was people in that kind of 40 to 50, maybe a bit older range who went from Tory to Labour. And similar thing happened in 2019, but in the other direction. So your political challenge,
these
your political challenge isn't necessarily the one of like, how do we get more young people to turn up? The issue is that how do you get just slightly more? Because if you look at the margins there, you could just get slightly more in the 40 to 50 range, and suddenly you're starting to win. And that's the challenge for the left. Unfortunately, there's no glamour in it. It's much nicer to have a story which is, boomers versus millennials, gammons versus young people. I mean, it's kind of nonsense. That is happening, but there's little you can do about it. The real fight is over what happens in the middle, unfortunately. It's the centrist dads that everyone's been rude to on Twitter for the last 4 years. In fact, you have to start, mollycoddling and saying, actually, we love you, really.
I mean, that's the thing, is that the left has been, and I've certainly been terrible at it. I'm much nicer in person.
I know,
but I suppose
that's true. That's completely true.
Not to you,
Oh, okay.
to everyone else. Is that something which the left's been bad at, is love bombing? Because obviously civility politics is bad politics, but it's the politics in which we live. So...
Final clip I want to show of the evening. Something we've talked about on the show before is that Liberals are taking quite a risk by having Joe Biden as their presidential candidate. It seems that, as we've just been discussing, some people are considering him more electable than Bernie Sanders. Not necessarily the case if you see him speak for more than 30 seconds. He recently swore at a unionized worker. What did you call it? A horse's...
Stop being a horse's ass.
Horse's ass. That was what he called it. It's not the clip I'm going to show.
That's what you call message discipline.
The clip I'm going to show is that some Liberals do seem to be waking up to the fact that Joe Biden could be a bit of a liability in a general election. This is Jake Tapper, who is the chief Washington correspondent for CNN. So this is a proper establishment guy. This is him talking last night.
I'm getting real 2004 vibes tonight, which is Democrats want to defeat an incumbent Republican so badly, Democratic voters, I mean, that they decide which one is electable, and they decide, okay, it's John Kerry, or in this case, it's Joe Biden. There's a huge coalescing around that person. They want to end the primary process as soon as possible, and then basically they coronate this person. Now, what did we learn in the last few weeks? Mark McKinnon, former George W. Bush advisor, told me that actually they feared Howard Dean more. Because Howard Dean, even though he was less predictable, there was a starker difference between Howard Dean and George W. Bush. And he was drawing much bigger crowds than John Kerry was able to. And Howard Dean, we had him on the Sunday show, and Howard Dean said, now you tell me. But the point is that when you have the Democratic electorate deciding that they are all a bunch of Rachel Maddows and Chris Hayes and the like, that they're just, progressive pundits and they're going to pick out who is the best one, maybe they don't necessarily always know what they're doing.
That was Jake Tapper, very establishment pundit, making a very good point. So he was saying in 2004, the conventional wisdom was that Howard Dean, who was the left populist candidate, he'd be a liability up against George W. Bush, and the safe pair of hands was John Kerry. The problem when it came to the election is no one was particularly interested in John Kerry. He lost, they voted for George W. Bush, and it turned out that the George W. Bush campaign, they were actually worried about the unpredictable, fiery guy who was getting big crowds. And the commentators saying it's a very similar analogy to Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Now,
fair.
I don't want to get conspiratorial here, but one thing that does frustrate me is why is it only that liberal commentators make these very reasonable points about how Bernie Sanders might actually be electable the day after it's basically become impossible for him to win the nomination. It's like, why didn't you say this before Super Tuesday? Obviously, it's correct. Obviously, you had a bit of contextual information there that was very useful for your audience to hear, that potentially Donald Trump's actually scared of Bernie Sanders not facing Joe Biden. But you kept that to yourself until the day after the delegate maths had got incredibly difficult for Bernie Sanders. It reminds me of, liberals in this country. You've got James O'Brien who's tweeting like, oh, well, the Tories are doing this about immigration. The Tories aren't doing well enough on climate change. It's like, well, you just spent, when the left actually had a chance of winning, you spent 3 years trashing the only person who could be a left-wing prime minister to actually change those policies. But once that's become impossible, once there's a safe distance between a leftist and government, that's when you can start adopting correct left-wing talking points, because there's no longer any risk of left-wing power.
This idea that Biden is predictable, because I'm not sure if you've heard him tell the corn pop story. Have you heard about the corn pop story?
I've heard the corn pop
So
story.
he's telling this story at an event which is really kind of like a rally for African-American voters. And he talks about when he was the only white lifeguard at predominantly African-American pool in the early 60s. And along comes this guy called Corn Pop who's acting him up. So Joe Biden kicks him out the pool. And then everyone was like, nah, you really fucked up because Corn Pop's a bad dude. Like he's got like a razor blade, da-da-da. And I think like Joe Biden got like a chain and maybe like a trash can lid or something went to confront him, and then I don't really understand what happened because the story is so incoherent that he's literally, do you remember that episode of The Simpsons where Grandpa Simpson is called in to break the strike at the nuclear power plant, and he's just telling this rambly story of like, and I had an onion tied to my belt, which was the style at the time, and it was exactly like that. So one of the things that I'm looking forward to in terms of the actual presidential campaigning debate, which I assume would be between Biden and Trump, is look, we know what's going to happen with a Sanders-Trump debate. So Sanders is going to be very good. With Biden and Trump, you're going to have two senile men circling each other like sharks on LSD. Anything can happen. And I hear what you're saying about the need for a left-wing politic which is capable of addressing the most significant challenges of our time: climate change, healthcare, aging populations, economic inequality. But 1 hour of entertainment.
I'm looking forward to the Trump-Biden debates.
Just a corn pop. I think there must be Americans out there who are going to look at these poor Brits not understanding the corn pop reference, or maybe it's just me. Why?
What is a corn pop?
It's a man. Corn pop is a man.
Oh, he was a man. Yeah, it was a name.
He was a bad dude with a razor.
Oh, do you know how the rambling story ends?
Kellogg's Corn Pops. It's the cereal, according to Gary.
No, the Joe Biden's story about corn pop anyway ends with him saying,
dissolves in milk.
Ends with him saying, I like having children on my lap. which is classic.
This is what happens when you don't have the word nonce in the American slang lexicon.
Right, Greg Collins asks, with it looking likely Biden will get the nomination, where does the American left go next?
Where's he go next? Well, look, the Democrat Party, for what it's worth, is an even more tenuous relationship to the organised working class and labour, and that gives it a sort of social basis. It sort of drifts around all over the place. In terms of what the American left does, then the most likely prospects you face from this point onwards is that Biden loses and you've got 4 more years of Trump, at which point, I wouldn't say all bets are off, but it starts to look pretty wild at that particular juncture. And the need to have an organisation which is distinct from the Democrat Party, I think, becomes quite apparent.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's two things, right? So we talked about why right-wing populists tend to have a higher ceiling than left-wing populists. One of them is that they've got Fox News. Mm-hmm. So the left need institutions which are comparable to Fox News, so that they can, whilst the mainstream media is incredibly biased against them, they can have someone else who's, fighting their corner.
But you're going to have to up my Botox budget.
I mean, the other is the left need to start understanding boomers, right? I mean, because they're going to be a very important voting bloc for a very long time.
And unless you boomers and dowers, boomers into
we've got downwards. We've got downwards. We need to get the boomers.
We haven't. The swing voters are the sort of Generation X. The swing voters are people born in 1960, 1965 through to sort of late 1970s.
But Bernie had all the way up to 49 in Michigan.
Yeah, but not enough. No, but look at the actual division. It's like 51-49, I thought.
Or if you just got 10% more people in their 50s and 60s, and that would push you. Obviously, the populist left is never going to win the over 65 vote. But if we got thrashed 60-40 instead of 80-20, then you get over the line.
Also not getting too carried away with the age divisions. You can make some difference all the way down the line in this. Some of it is also, I think, just getting better at thinking what an alliance looks like with people who don't actually necessarily agree with you 100%. Because the minute there's been an awful lot of like, we have this thing and everybody's lined up behind this thing and everyone agrees with it 100%. And the left has got exceptionally bad where it has ended up in a position where it might take power of thinking like, how do we relate to people who don't actually agree 100% or even 70%? Like, what is the offer we're going to make there? And finding ways to box that off in terms of the policy offer, in terms of your campaign offer, in terms of the wider politics of the movement, political culture for sure, is going to be critically important. I'd very much like to see some attempts on the left in general to think through what that means without losing the fact that, broadly speaking, I think we're right and we have to do these things in order to actually mean that we don't end up with rampant climate change and all the rest of it. But how do you make that offer work for a whole load of people who don't agree with you 100% in every dot and comma is the absolute strategic problem at the minute.
Isaac Lee asks an interesting question. Will the change in debate format benefit either of the candidates? And the context here is that, and it's an interesting question because me and Ash were talking earlier about how Bernie Sanders has lost, and it wasn't rigged. I mean, Bernie Sanders lost because not enough people voted for him, because not enough people wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders. Yes, there's a rigged media system, but it doesn't seem like the Democratic National Convention or Committee or whatever it is, the party rigged it. But there is one sort of laughable, unbelievable decision they've made to. It does seem Biden looks like he'll be winning anyway, but to advantage Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders, which is at the moment after Super Tuesday, it turned out that the next debate would only have Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden in it. They completely changed the format because they knew that if it was Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, taking chunks out of each other, Bernie Sanders would obviously win. So they've changed the format. So they're both going to be sitting down and they're both going to be sort of taking questions separate. Well, it was going to be taking questions separately from the audience, but now the audience aren't allowed to turn up because of coronavirus. So I'm not precisely sure. I'm not precisely sure how the format is going to work. But in any case, they've made it so it's not going to be head to head Biden versus Sanders, which, you can see why if you want Biden to win, that's what you'd go for. But when it comes to the general election, I'm sorry, DNC, but there's not going to be an agreement from Donald Trump that actually you're going to do the debate sitting down and not taking chunks out of each other, because Donald Trump is going to take chunks out of that guy. And primary voters deserve to know whether or not Biden can handle that kind of pressure.
And also don't forget is that through the debates in 2016, the overwhelming consensus was that Hillary Clinton dominated them because she was coherent, she was precise, she could be across detail. She was, by all measures by which we normally measure a debate, very good, very adept. Donald Trump just did loads of weird shit. Like, do you remember when he was just sort of like looming behind her and just sort of like peering into shot in all these weird ways, like interrupting, being rude, being uncivil? The idea that you can have a managed environment in which Biden can do well and in which you won't have an opponent who will go very, very low when it comes to exploiting, what might generously be called idiosyncrasies, what might ungenerously be called oncoming senility, it's for the birds.
I mean, I suppose there were two theories about electability from the left and the centre when it came to these primaries. The left's idea was that Donald Trump proved that anti-establishment populists can win, so we should put up an anti-establishment populist. The centre saw someone who can't finish sentences can become president, so we should put up someone who can't finish sentences, which means we're going to have... Actually, what's going to be even better than watching the Biden-Trump debate is going to be reading the transcription.
Oh my God.
When you read the transcription of like Trump
you've seen
comments,
these who said
amazing.
What quizzes.
Yeah.
So who said what Biden or Trump thing. It's hard to tell. No, there's a real point to having proper debates. I mean, and Biden has done a few, but there's a real point to having proper debates. Look at Theresa May, no debate whatsoever, crowned. Right now, Boris Johnson did actually have to go through a process of some testing beforehand. It does kind of filter out people who are obviously going to be not very good if you have to subject them to some sort of scrutiny beforehand. And if that isn't happening in a serious way to Joe Biden, because if he's the front runner, but he has no serious debate, he would, you'd expect, have mincemeat made out of him by Donald Trump in a way that, unlike Hillary Clinton, actually benefits Donald Trump this time round.
Should we wrap it up?
Yeah.
We're going to go home keeping a safe distance to... Actually, today on the tube, when you get on the train and then it's rush
tense.
hour and
tense.
everyone, it's
tense.
super tense
Smites,
and everyone's
smell of
falling out
hand
because no one
sanitizer.
wants to touch the bar. So every time the train stops, everyone's like, it's like, but then you're like, oh, this could be counterproductive because if I fall into someone and like land on them, then I'm more likely to get coronavirus. But do you take the risk of holding the bar or do you take the risk of falling into someone when the train
So
stops suddenly?
what happened on the train is that you get on a crowded train, there's actually really refined social rules governing space and blah blah blah. So when you have to be uncomfortably close to someone, you do that little under your breath sorry, things like that. And how a man is being creepy is when he's standing really really close and sort of bumping against you in a weird way, and there are none of those sorries, right? And that's when it's kind of deliberate, and there's a fair amount of space. This guy who just kept doing it, and I was like, I'm just going to fake a coughing fit. So I was just and he moved like that. It was so good. So good. Coronavirus, very, very bad.
Clearing
This
a space in
move,
the tube.
Ladies. Excellent.
James Meadway, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Ash Sarkar, always a delight.
Not really.
Not just a pleasure. You've been watching Tisky Sow. You've been watching Novara Media. I'm Michael Walker. Good night.